청소년을 건강한 생활을 할 수 있게끔 도와주는 게 바로 저는 태권도라고 생각이 듭니다.
Not only did Mother experience this change, but her fellow teammates also felt reborn due to the dramatic change in their lives.
너무 좋아요. 온 세상을 다 얻은 것 같죠. 제가 태권도 전도사가 된 것 같아요.
열정이 높으신 분이죠. 그 가족 전체가 태권도 가족입니다. 아주 화목하고 건강이 넘치는 대한민국의 대표적인 태권도 가족이 아닌가 싶습니다.
We're a family that loves practicing Taekwondo, so we've embarked on a new challenge.
사실 저희 가족들이 아픔이 정말 많습니다. 제가 아침에 일어났는데 반신이 마비가 왔었고 저희 아이는 태어나자마자 인공 심박기를 달았었고 정상으로도 살기 힘들다는 진단을 받았었지만 이 아이를 보면서 기적이라는 것을 알게 됐거든요. 그래서 태권도는 행복 그 자체입니다.
태권도를 해서 강해지니까 더 자신감이 올라가고 행복해요.
I believe Taekwondo is a blessing from heaven. It has made us hopeful for the future. Every day, we're excited to see what's in store for us tomorrow. Practice it with your family. Taekwondo brings happiness.
The Constitutional Court holds the final impeachment hearing for President Yoon as both sides wrap up arguments over the expulsion of the leader for his short-lived martial law imposition. The president also speaks. The nation's central bank has lowered its key rate by 25 basis points to 2.75% as part of its efforts to prop up the economy. Korea's growth forecast for this year has been revised down to 1.5%. A bridge collapsed at a highway construction site in Ansong on Tuesday morning, resulting in 10 casualties. It's February 25th, 8 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. As we begin, President Yoon Suk-yeol's final impeachment trial hearing continues, with the leader delivering his closing statements. To bring us the latest, we have our correspondent Oh Soo-young at the Constitutional Court. So-young, there's been anticipation surrounding what the president will say. But first, walk us through what's happened so far.
Sure, Dongmin. So President Yoon's 11th and final impeachment trial hearing began at around 2 p.m. today, some 73 days after the National Assembly passed a motion to remove him from power following his December 3rd martial law order. And as the session began, justices began reviewing evidence that they haven't scrutinized yet, then gave both the National Assembly and President Yoon's legal teams 2 hours each to present their closing arguments. The National Assembly has been arguing that Yoon's declaration of martial law was illegal and his orders on December 3rd unconstitutional. The impeachment panel said Yoon's actions subvert the country's democracy and brought disruption to the constitutional order.
President Yoon lost the people's trust and declared martial law while ranting about anti-state forces. Now it's time for him to face the consequences of his delusions.
Meanwhile, Yoon's legal team has continued to insist martial law is an executive right of the president and was declared as a warning against the dominant opposition party's tyranny in parliament that paralysed government functions through around 29 impeachment attempts. His lawyers also reiterated that the National Assembly had not been shut down, supporting Yoon's claim that, quote, nothing actually happened, and continued to raise concerns over election fraud. After wrapping up the arguments, it's now time for the closing statements by the National Assembly's impeachment panel chair Chung Chong-le and President Yoon himself. Now, President Yoon has reportedly prepared a 40-minute long handwritten speech, and he's expected to reiterate that the purpose of his martial law was peaceful and that he was trying to bring about national unity. All eyes are on whether he would offer some kind of political gesture or compromise to draw public appeal.
And after today, the deliberation period begins with the verdict, likely to be delivered around March 11th.
That's right. The ruling will be drafted around 2 weeks after the final hearing date today. And before that, though, as you said, the deliberation period begins with Presiding Justice Chung Yong-sik, who's going to present his review to his 7 colleagues before all 8 justices on the bench vote either for or against impeachment. And the final ruling will be drafted based on the majority opinion. If the presiding justice holds a minority view, then another justice from the majority will be assigned to draft the decision. The court will then decide the date to announce the verdict, which is again expected within 2 weeks, as you said, around mid-March. If 6 or more of the 8 justices vote in favour of impeachment, then President Yoon will be removed from office, triggering a snap presidential election within 60 days. However, if at least 3 justices oppose impeachment, the motion will be dismissed and Yoon will immediately resume his duties.
In the meantime, So-young, public rallies for and against impeachment are likely to continue. What has it been like today?
Well, as much as today marks the last hearing of President Yoon's impeachment trial, the Constitutional Court, the area around it, has been closed off for public safety and order, as large crowds are very much expected to be. They have been crowding the court, the area around the court, and very much staying throughout. And we can even hear screams and chanting even now as we speak. And some 3,800 police officers have been installed around the area in Chungno-gu district, and that's the largest mobilization we've seen since President Yoon first started attending his hearings, around 1,000 more than the average hearing saw. Also, 190 buses have been blocking paths to the court to restrict any kind of movement coming towards the court. Around 1,500 reportedly gathered in the next street to oppose Yoon's impeachment shortly before the hearing began, and the chanting can very much still be heard from here at the court.
Right, a day full of tension indeed. Thanks, So-young, for keeping us updated. Staying at the Constitutional Court, the verdict on whether or not acting President Choi Sang-mok violated the Constitution in deferring the appointment of Court Justice nominee Ma Eun-hyuk will be shared at 10 in the morning this coming Thursday. This legal dispute follows the filing of a lawsuit by National Assembly Speaker Woo Won-sik earlier this month after acting President Choi appointed just 2 of the 3 justice nominees recommended by the opposition-led parliament, citing the lack of bipartisan support for Ma Eun-hyuk. Assembly Speaker Woo claims Choi's decision violated the right of the parliament to nominate a constitutional court justice. If the court rules in favor of Woo and Choi proceeds to appoint Ma to the court, all seats of its 9-member bench will be filled. But it's unclear whether Ma will participate in passing judgment on President Yoon's impeachment. Moving on, policymakers at the central bank have decided to lower their key lending rate to boost the local economy, whose growth for this year has been also lowered. Our correspondent Moon Hae-ryun has the details.
South Korea's central bank has lowered its benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points as widely expected, bringing it down to 2.75%. The decision was announced on Tuesday following the second Monetary Policy Committee meeting of the year, resuming its rate-cutting cycle after 2 consecutive rate cuts in October and November last year, followed by a pause in January.
The committee today determined that while concerns in the foreign exchange market remain, a further rate cut was necessary to support the economy as inflation is stabilizing, household debt growth is slowing, and signs of a significant slowdown are becoming more evident.
The central bank's decision reflects its growing concerns over South Korea's rapidly slowing economy, weighed down by both domestic and global challenges. Global trade uncertainties heightened by U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff hikes and continued political turmoil following the martial law declaration last December led the central bank to also slash its economic growth projection for 2025. Lowering its forecast for GDP growth this year by 0.4 percentage points to 1.5%. It's the first time since 2022 that the BOK has revised its projection by such a large amount. Its projection for 2026 remains unchanged, as does its outlook for consumer price inflation this year. This falls in line with forecasts from other major economic institutions such as the Korea Development Institute, which also lowered its 2025 forecast from 2% to 1.6%. South Korea's real GDP growth in 2024 came in at just 2%, falling short of the central bank's earlier forecast of 2.2%, as weak consumer spending and sluggish construction investment were further exacerbated by the domestic political crisis. The rate cut is seen as an effort to counteract economic headwinds by boosting domestic consumption and investment and preventing a steeper downturn.
I don't think you'll see any results within the next few months, and that's because there's a usual time lag between lowering the interest rate and what you see in the markets. So I think if we want to see the full effect from the interest rate cut, we need to have supplementary budget spending quickly.
However, concerns remain. The widening interest rate gap between the U.S. and South Korea, now at 1.75 percentage points, raises the risks of capital outflow, which could further weaken the Korean won and push inflation higher. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
The authorities are easing their green belts for the first time in almost 20 years as part of efforts to spur business investment. Choi Soo-hyung reports.
Greenbelt restrictions will be lifted for some areas of the country for the first time since 2008.
For the first time in 17 years since 2008, more Greenbelt land can be released. This will actively support national and regional industrial, logistics, and urban projects.
In the 5-grade Greenbelt system, the government will allow the release of Grade 1 and 2 areas holding high conservation value. These areas were not originally eligible for deregulation, but will be permitted only if alternative Greenbelt areas are designated. With this deregulation, the government plans to attract more business investments in the regions. The goal is to develop 15 key regional projects in major cities across the country, excluding the Seoul metropolitan area. The cities of Changwon and Ulsan, which had a high proportion of Grade 1 and 2 greenbelt areas, were selected for 4 and 3 sites, respectively. Gwangju and Busan each received 3 sites, while Daejeon and Daegu were allocated 1 site each. More than 10 out of the 15 selected locations will be used for industrial and logistics complexes. The total area set to be released is 42 square kilometers, equivalent to about 5,900 football fields. 35% of that are grades 1 and 2, and the government plans to consider publicly owned land as alternative sites. The total project will cost 27.8 trillion Korean won, approximately $19.4 billion. After the development procedures are completed, the deregulation will proceed gradually starting next year. To prevent real estate speculation, these areas will be designated as land transaction permit zones, meaning any land transactions would require prior approval. Moreover, the government will launch a 1 trillion won fund for 12 national strategic technologies, including semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and advanced biotechnology. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News.
Earlier this morning, structures supporting a bridge under construction collapsed in the city of Anseong, killing 4 workers. Investigations are underway to determine the exact cause of the incident. An Song-jin brings the latest.
At least 4 people died and 6 were injured, some seriously, on early Tuesday after the collapse of concrete structures supporting a highway bridge under construction in Anseong, south of the country's capital Seoul. All of the casualties were workers at the site on the Seoul-Sejong Expressway. The construction workers were on the underdeck installing support beams when 5 50-meter concrete structures collapsed. The National Fire Agency was quick to issue a nationwide emergency order while completing its rescue efforts.
The police and fire departments are cooperating to identify the exact cause of the incident, but nothing has been found so far.
However, speculation has arisen that the catastrophe may have happened in the process of installing the underdecks after one of the beams was loaded, leading one to collapse after the other like dominoes. Acting President Choi Sang-mok called for the mobilization of all available personnel and resources to prevent any further damage. The Gyeonggi Nambu Provincial Police Agency said it will form an investigative team with 78 members to determine the cause of the collapse. The police also plan to thoroughly examine whether there are any grounds to file involuntary manslaughter charges. The Ministry of Interior and Safety asked Anseong to do its best to support the victims and their family members, while the Ministry of Land and Infrastructure established a response headquarters to oversee the prompt resolution of the incident. The main contractor of the construction site, Hyundai Engineering, issued an official apology and stated that it is actively cooperating with the relevant authorities to ensure the correct identification of the cause of the collapse. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
U.S. President Donald Trump and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron met at the White House for talks on ending the war in Ukraine amid a shift in America's stance towards the war-torn nation. Lee Soo-jin has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron agreed on the deployment of European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine as part of efforts to end the 3-year conflict. The 2 heads of state met at the White House on Monday to discuss strategies for a ceasefire as European leaders seek to persuade the Trump administration to maintain its support for Ukraine and the transatlantic alliance. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is also scheduled to meet with Trump on Thursday to discuss the deployment of peacekeepers in Ukraine. But the meeting came after the U.S. earlier in the day voted against the United Nations resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This shift in stance from the previous U.S. administration has raised concerns in Europe. At the joint press conference, Macron said Europe was prepared to provide security guarantees to Ukraine.
So we have prepared, particularly with our British partners. We are ready to provide security guarantees. It could go as far as the president said, sending troops who would observe that peace was properly respected, who would position themselves not on the front line, not to enter into the conflict, but to mark their presence as a guarantee.
Macron also stressed that peace must not mean Ukraine's surrender. When asked directly about whether Russian President Vladimir Putin was ready to accept European peacekeepers, Trump remained confident.
Yeah, he will accept that. He will accept. I've asked him that question. It's time to end this bloodletting and restore peace, and I think we're going to do it. We've had some great conversations, including with Russia.
He also said that he believed that the war in Ukraine could end within weeks, adding that Zelensky could visit him at the White House in the next 2 weeks to sign a minerals deal. At a summit of European leaders held in Kyiv to mark the 3rd anniversary of the war, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky echoed this, saying that he hopes that the war will be concluded this year, while also stressing the importance of having security guarantees to prevent future Russian aggression. 이수진, Arirang News.
Marking 3 years of the Ukraine war, the United Nations Security Council has adopted a U.S.-led resolution that called for an end to the war, but contained no criticism of Russia. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Pei-Yun-ji explains.
The UN Security Council adopted a resolution on the Ukraine war proposed by the United States that did not name Russia as the aggressor. This reflects a dramatic shift in American policy towards Ukraine under the Trump administration. It's also the first time that the 15-member council has adopted a resolution on the Ukraine war since Russia's invasion 3 years ago, as it had been unable to take any action because Russia holds veto power.
This resolution puts us on the path to peace. It is a first step, but a crucial one of which we should all be proud.
10 members voted in favor and no nations opposed, while 5 European countries abstained from the vote. Those countries, including Britain, France, Denmark, Greece, and Slovenia, attempted to amend the wording ahead of the vote to hold Russia accountable, but failed after Russia vetoed. South Korea, a non-permanent member of the Security Council, voted in favor of both the U.S.-led resolution and the European-led amendments. But it expressed disappointment, saying efforts to change the wording were not reflected in the document drafted by Washington.
In this light, the Republic of Korea voted in favor of the amendments proposed by 5 European countries, and we voted in favor of the draft resolution proposed by the United States. Although it is regrettable that the amendments we supported were not reflected.
An official from Seoul's foreign ministry told reporters on Tuesday that South Korea made the decision as the resolution pushes for a swift end to the Ukraine war, and added that it also considered the importance of the relationship between Seoul and Washington. Separately, at the UN General Assembly on the same day, Ukraine and the European Union drafted a resolution that reaffirms Kyiv's territorial integrity while explicitly naming Russia as the aggressor. The 193-member world body backed this resolution with 93 votes, while 18 nations voted against it. And surprisingly, the United States was among the countries that voted against, along with Russia, Israel, North Korea, and Sudan, once again highlighting its change of stance on the war. Unlike the Security Council resolutions, those adopted by the UN General Assembly are not considered legally binding, but are seen as a barometer of world opinion. Pei-Yun-ji, Arirang News.
Over in Geneva, South Korea has urged North Korea to abandon its nuclear ambitions and return to denuclearization talks. Speaking at the conference on disarmament on Monday, Second Vice Foreign Minister Kang In-sun condemned Pyongyang for violating multiple UN Security Council resolutions. She also criticized the regime for supplying weapons and ballistic missiles to Russia while deploying over 11,000 troops to help its war in Ukraine. Kang also expressed concern over the weakening of global disarmament norms amid Russia's prolonged war in Ukraine, calling on nuclear powers to strengthen trust and transparency through dialogue.
With March just around the corner, the last cold spell is finally easing off. The temperatures rose up to 7 degrees Celsius, widening the daily temperature difference by about 10 degrees. There are still many places that are slightly below the previous year's temperatures, so it will feel colder than the actual readings. Meanwhile, a small amount of rain or snow is expected in western parts of Gangwon-do province from late tonight to dawn tomorrow. However, it won't be enough to relieve the dryness. Since wildfires are increasing in this dry weather, please take extra care. Tomorrow morning, Seoul will start off at -2 degrees, Busan at 3 degrees. Daily highs will move up to 9 degrees in Daejeon and Gwangju, 11 degrees in Daegu and Gyeongju. Warm spring weather like late March will continue until the 3일절 holiday this weekend. That's all for Korea. There are the weather conditions around the world.
And that is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session up next.
How to survive in Korea. Weddings. Step 0. Attire. As a guest, dress formal to business casual. Avoid wearing all white, shorts or going topless. Step 1. Arrival time. Arrive 30 minutes prior to the wedding ceremony. Too many cars, too many halls, too many people. There are many twists and turns. Take pictures and shake hands. And write your name vertically, not horizontally, in the guest book. Step 2. Or, shibor. 50,000 won, 100,000 won, 150,000 won. Cash gifts are given in these units. Decide on the amount based on your relationship. Write your name vertically on the envelope. Step 3. Wedding etiquette. Fill up the front row. Guests have 3 duties to fulfill: clapping, cheering, and taking pictures. Step 4. Dining. Take off your jacket. This will be your seat from now on. Start with the not your everyday delicacies. Galbijjim. Yes. Bosa. Yes. Chili shrimps. Definitely yes. Kimbap. Yeah. Only if you can't live without it. No need to pile up food. You have more than one opportunity. Did you survive the wedding? Wait, did someone catch your eye? What are you waiting for? You're looking fine today.
We gon' pump it up. Watch out, ooh,
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gen. As the Ukraine war enters its third year, the conflict is reaching a decisive phase. On the eve of the anniversary, Russia unleashed its largest drone attack yet, leaving destruction and death in their wake. Ukrainians endure relentless air raids and mourn their dead, while the U.S. holds high-level talks with Russia without Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky marked the anniversary with desperate hope, claiming he wants to end the war this year. Calling for NATO and EU membership as Ukraine's best defense against future aggression, he insisted that peace must come through strength and unity. But over in Moscow, Vladimir Putin had a different message. Awarding top military honors, he declared that destiny and God had given Russians the mission to defend their homeland, stressing that Russia is in this for the long haul. With Ukraine battered, Western support wavering, and Russia digging in, the critical question remains, where does this war go from here? For more on this, we invite Pan Gil-ju, assistant professor at Korean National Diplomatic Academy, with us. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, good to be with you.
And also joining us is our go-to Voice of America correspondent, Jessica Stone. Good to see you again, Jessica.
Good to be with you.
So let's start with Jessica. The war, like I've said, has now entered its third year. How has the situation on the ground evolved over the past year, and what are the key developments leading up to today?
Well, it's essentially a military stalemate. In 2024 alone, 43,000 Ukrainians were killed, and according to a BBC estimate, 95,000 Russian troops were killed. And we're not counting civilians here, right? We're counting troops. People are really tired in the United States of supporting this war. They were very supportive at the beginning, but now that support is beginning to wane, especially on the right. Washington and Moscow have established a framework for peace talks in Saudi Arabia, as we saw last week. And now we've got this discussion of critical minerals going on, which is some kind of joint venture being proposed by Washington to engage with Kyiv to try to get those rare earth minerals, a more secure supply for Washington, and a steady stream of revenue for Kyiv.
Right, so clearly the situation on the ground remains fluid, both sides adapting their strategies. But beyond the battlefield, we've also seen major shifts in global politics as well. Let's take a step back and look at the broader geopolitical implications as well. So as the war reaches its third year, Professor Ban, what are the biggest geopolitical shifts we have seen in the balance of power between the West and Russia?
Well, we need to take a look at the balance of power from the two perspectives: geopolitical balance of power and strategic balance of power. First of all, the geopolitical balance of power between the West and Russia remains unchanged in the sense that no one has not won the war yet, and the European countries continue to indirectly project their military and geopolitical power against Russian power. In particular, Russia's war on Ukraine encouraged NATO members to be increased to 32 states as of right now. Meanwhile, Russia is supported by North Korea's military support, including the dispatch of its military troops. Accordingly, geopolitical competition or confrontation continues without shifting the geopolitical balance of power. However, the strategic balance of power is shifting significantly under the second Trump administration. The second Trump administration's mega strategy allows the United States to bash European countries, its allies, and makes Russia favorable strategically. At the 61st Munich Security Conference, the United States stayed away from European countries, and in this vein is not their like-minded countries anymore. So the concept of the West is not meaningful anymore, at least in a strategic sense. Under this changing diplomatic behavior, a strategic balance of power between the West and Russia is weakening seriously. All in all, we are living in a very transitional order where uncertainty is mounting, both diplomatically and strategically.
So let's go back to the mineral deal between the U.S. and Ukraine. There are reports, like Jessica said, that the U.S. is nearing a mineral agreement with Ukraine in exchange for continued support. Jessica, mind us again, what are the key points of this agreement, and how is it being received by the global community?
Well, we don't know all the specifics yet. It's basically a joint venture being proposed by Washington, and whether it's a 50-50 split or, as we heard over the weekend, the U.S. wants 100% of the control. It's not clear where they will land, but they are discussing some sort of deal that would allow the U.S. to help pay for part of the development of these rare earth minerals, which would in turn help Kyiv recover economically and give the U.S. a very vested interest in the safety and security of the of Ukraine. And of course, this doesn't come explicitly with troops on the ground or a security guarantee, but implicit there, according to Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, in a podcast, he says this is, quote, the best security guarantee Ukraine could ask for. But of course, Ukraine wants to hear about a physical security guarantee, weapons, peacekeepers, and the like. President Trump says this deal is very close to the end. We don't know if that's actually the case, but he says he expects to see President Zelensky come to sign it either later this week or next week. It's just a fascinating proposal. Of course, it will have to be agreed to by the legislature in Ukraine before it can move forward.
Right. So if this deal, if it gets finalized, it would definitely reshape Ukraine's economic and strategic position. But as Jessica pointed out, there are growing concern about security, especially, since the current agreements do not include formal guarantees yet. So, Professor Ban, if Ukraine does not receive the security guarantees that it really seeks for, what kind of alternative strategies could it pursue to ensure its own defense?
From the standpoint of Ukraine, it is not easy for Ukraine to adopt an alternative strategy because it retains historical lessons learned. Ukraine was historically confronted with a security dilemma where its negotiation to guarantee its security increased the long-term risk of war ending in failure for its security. In 1994, Ukraine signed a Budapest Memorandum with the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia, which is based on the trade-off between nuclear weapons and security guarantees. This memorandum failed to prevent Russia from annexing the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. To top it off, the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula increased military tension in the eastern region of Ukraine, which includes Donetsk and Luhansk. So, Ukraine again decided to sign the Minsk agreements with Russia. Despite these efforts to manage a crisis in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, which means agreements are fundamentally unfunctional against Russia's geopolitical ambition. In this sense, Ukraine in a situation where it cannot trust any security guarantees. Despite this fact, even security guarantees by the United States are rarely expected. This is a recurring security dilemma that Ukraine faces. The best scenario is that the United States directly provides a security guarantee by deploying American forces so that all parties can preserve on upcoming agreement. This option does not look feasible as of right now. So the second scenario is that the United States allows Ukraine to become a member of NATO, although the United States gradually stays away from NATO and Europe. What happens is that the United States doesn't like this option either. The third scenario is that Europe establishes its own defense forces and then they are dispatched to Ukraine as part of the effort for peacekeeping and deterrence. Under this scenario, a step for Ukraine to join the European Union can be facilitated. I don't think that other options than these three scenarios are not receivable to Ukraine because of its painful lessons learned from history.
So it looks like a very tough situation for Ukraine. But on the bright side, the UN had recently introduced a resolution condemning Russia. But the United States did not co-sponsor it. Instead, Washington proposed its own resolution, framing the war as a conflict rather than an invasion. So what does this shift in language suggest about U.S. policy towards Ukraine, Jessica?
What it suggests is that the U.S. is attempting to soften the language around the resolution because as they said yesterday during the UN Security Council vote, We all urge Security Council members to join the United States. We hear our European colleagues when they say they want a durable peace, but not at any cost. I would say rest assured that we too seek this durable peace. And we would remind these colleagues that this resolution is not a peace deal. It imposes no cost. Rather, this resolution represents the path to peace. So they are taking a different stance, not using the resolution to condemn Russia, softening the language around that, making clear that the end goal is a peace deal, not the condemnation of who's at fault, which is, of course, anathema to many in Europe, including the Ukrainians. They don't want to hear that there is no responsibility laid at Moscow's feet. But this is the approach that the Trump administration is taking. As you said, we saw Moscow and Washington on the same side of a vote that was passed unanimously to support Ukraine and condemn Russia's actions. And by contrast, we saw the U.S. draft pass unanimously in the UN Security Council, where, of course, Russia has a veto. So there is a realignment going on here globally in terms of how to end this war. And what the U.S. is doing hasn't been tried before, and it's not really something that the Europeans and the Ukrainians support, but we'll have to see if it can accomplish its goal.
Mm-hmm. So with this, the U.S. has gone from being one of Ukraine's strongest backers to blocking a resolution that condemns Russia. Professor Ban, what strategic interests might be driving this shift?
Well, the United States' reluctance to define Russia as an invader is most likely to lead to not simply a great shift, but a great upheaval in the diplomatic arena. At first glance, this shift is driven by strategic calculations to end the Russia-Ukraine war as fast as possible. The United States' eagerness to change the term invasion to conflict in the resolution seems to be strategically designed to maximize its transactional approach. The Trump administration believes that it can step up its leverage over Russia in its role as a mediator to end the war by currying favor with Russia. What worries me is that this approach is short-sighted and could help Russia step up its leverage over the United States and the West, not the other way around. So, if so, what challenges are ahead of us? Well, to begin with, this unprecedented posture of the United States could serve as a driver to neutralize a concept of like-minded country coordination. In fact, when being judged on the United States' stance on this resolution, the United States is more aligned with revisionists like Belarus and North Korea, which has supported Russia from the beginning of the war. Second, a rules-based order that has been established after World War II is going to be greatly weaker in the sense that the United States' position could trigger a perception to disregard or forgive an invader who broke a rule of sovereignty. Finally, power politics will be at the forefront in the diplomatic arena. Power dominance will play a role in international politics, not diplomatic communication or role of an international community to protect universal values like human rights.
So all of these could bring, dangerous impacts to the global landscape. But now we hear that Russia has confirmed that preparations are underway for a U.S.-Russia summit, but it had high-level talks having already been held in Saudi Arabia. But with the absence of Ukraine, Jessica, what were the key outcomes of these discussions, and why do we think that Ukraine had been left out?
Well, this is really a reframing of how to reach peace, right? It's similar, some in the Trump administration would say, to how Nixon approached China in the 70s. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, gave an interview to an independent journalist, Catherine Herridge, and said the biggest outcome is that the U.S. and Moscow are talking, that their embassies are going to be restored, that there's a regular conversation going on. He claims that there was no conversation for 3.5 years at high levels, and that you can't reach a peace deal without having open lines of communications. And both countries have now also committed to getting negotiators for a group to work out an end to the Ukraine war. Rubio says it's not clear one way or another whether Moscow will engage in a peace deal, and that what this process is for is to determine that. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has also said that Washington is pursuing classic shuttle diplomacy, going from one side to the other. And essentially, they had to reestablish contact with Moscow in order to be able to go to Moscow and see what their appetite is for a deal and what the outlines of a deal. So we have a real sea shift, as we've been noting here, from treating Russia as a pariah state, something like Iran, to trying to engage with them and see where they are in terms of what they actually will accept in terms of a peace deal. And the hope in Washington's part is, as you said, Professor Bond, bringing a quick end to this war by establishing what are both sides willing to accept.
Right, so it's a good thing that they have resumed talks in 3.5 years, but the fact that Ukraine's not included, it's still deeply concerning. Well, some analysts are even comparing this current situation to the 1938 Munich Agreement, where major powers negotiated over a small nation's fate without its participation. Do you see parallels, Professor Bond? And if so, what are the risks?
Well, the 1938 Munich Agreement clearly shows how politics was at the forefront back then. Meanwhile, I would say that the 2025 case is worse than the 1938 case. Why do I think like that? First of all, a characteristic of actors, a level of harmony between them are quite different. Europe attempted to curry favor with Nazi Germany to prevent the outbreak of World War II back then, 86 years ago. In contrast, when it comes to the US-led initiative to end the war this time, Europe strongly opposes a Russian invader, but the United States attempted to appease him. In short, the West is divided. Second, unlike Czechoslovakia, Ukraine has already fought directly against Russia for more than 3 years, which means it strictly retains a more eligible party to play a direct role in negotiation. So I would say that this appeasement policy to exclude Ukraine could serve as a negative stepping stone that any country can invade other countries if the former has military power enough to do that. To put it another way, an expansionist policy or an imperial posture can be tolerated in international politics, leading to the rise of numerous wars in the world. Similarly, revisionists like China and North Korea could be motivated to take advantage of this opportunity. China could rush to invade Taiwan, and North Korea could step up its localized military provocations and its nuclear coercion.
Right, so it could expand.
On the notion that Ukraine is not being included in these consultations at all. This is something that has really emerged over the last few days from U.S. officials that are saying that are inside these negotiations. We are talking to Ukraine, they will tell you. We are just not talking to them in the same meeting at the same time as the Russians. We will pick up the phone and call the Russians and then immediately call the Ukrainians. And obviously, there is a conversation between Keith Kellogg and Ukraine when it comes to, he is the Ukraine envoy. So I think what you have is just a multi-pronged approach. It's certainly not something that we've seen before, but the Americans would definitely push back on the notion that Ukraine is not part of these negotiations. They recognize that they have to be, but they feel that there has been so little communication with Moscow that they needed to reestablish that first.
Right. So let's also touch upon the situation in Europe. Europe is now facing tough decisions of its own. Jessica, how are key European leaders, such as, from the UK and France, positioning themselves in response to these developments?
Well, we certainly saw a charm offensive by Emmanuel Macron at the White House on Monday. I mean, he's the first European leader to come to meet with Trump. The conversation was largely focused on peace in Ukraine and how to achieve it. We saw him. You saw right there, he just touched the president and corrected him very boldly about what he says is wrong information that Trump was putting out about whether Europe was on the hook financially for its investments in Ukraine and in the war. Trump had said they were loans, they were going to get repaid. Macron said, no, they're actually, we might get paid 60% back. They're more like grants, much more similar to what the United States is providing. So this was a diplomatic masterclass, really, in how to be friendly with Trump, correct Trump, redirect Trump on the way that Emmanuel Macron was acting. And he is definitely coming to the table and saying, we will provide more security guarantees. We will increase our military commitment here. And that is exactly what the White House wants to hear. They do not want to be putting troops on the ground. They do not want to be the only country that is invested in the security of Ukraine. And the narrative in the White House certainly is that they have been.
Mm-hmm. So this would be definitely reassuring for this in Ukraine's part. But given these kinds of developments that we've discussed, Professor Ban, how do you foresee the Ukraine war evolving in the coming months? Do you see a realistic path toward a lasting peace, or are we heading toward a prolonged, frozen conflict?
To be honest with you, the current initiative to end the war is far from a perpetual peace or a lasting peace. This approach might be helpful to temporarily freeze military fights on the battlefield, but is most likely to lead to a bigger war later on. A just war termination matters more than a fast war termination for regional and geopolitical stability from a long-term perspective. History tells us the policy to appease Hitler in 1938 failed to prevent the outbreak of an approaching war. The West's lack of a resolute policy to grapple with Putin's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula led to another big military ambition, which is war on Ukraine in 2022. So I have to say the current US-led initiative is most likely to head toward a prolonged frozen conflict, and to be more precise, a larger war that will take place later. That explains why an international community should play an enhanced role in ending this war in a more just way by engaging with the United States more intensively.
Right, so global efforts are necessary at this point, and it seems the road ahead would be very uncertain. But we'll have to see how evolving geopolitical landscape and shifting alliances and ongoing military struggles will continue to shape the future of this conflict. But for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insights, Professor Ban.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, our Jessica.
Good to be with you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.
News for and by MZers, News Generation. Panelists in their 20s and